There's a specific sound that survivors of Comanche raids have described repeatedly, across different decades and in completely independent accounts, as the exact moment they knew their lives were about to change forever. It wasn't the sound of horses. It wasn't the sound of screaming. It was the silence that came immediately before. Researchers who have examined dozens of preserved testimonies from survivors of attacks on the 19th century Texas frontier identify this specific pattern with a consistency that they themselves describe as genuinely disturbing. The moment of absolute calm, where even domestic animals seemed to feel something that humans could not yet consciously and fully process. And then everything changed in seconds. This investigation does not intend to romanticize or demonize either side of this historical conflict that this series has already examined through multiple complementary perspectives. It aims instead to reconstruct, through preserved documentation and through direct testimonies from those who lived through this experience, what it genuinely meant to survive one of the most terrifying types of attack documented in the history of the American frontier. Because behind every statistic about Comanche incursions, behind every tactical analysis of military superiority and territorial knowledge ever examined in previous investigations in this series, there are individual human stories about people who had to, in a matter of seconds, make decisions that would determine whether they lived or died. The question this investigation aims to explore is how exactly these people survived, when they survived, and what that specific survival required in terms of impossible decisions, genuine luck, and psychological resources that no one should ever need to discover they possess. To fully understand what it meant to survive a Comanche attack on the Texas border, it is first necessary to understand that these attacks, according to military analyses already examined in previous investigations in this series, rarely followed a predictable pattern that allowed for genuinely adequate defensive preparation. Researchers who study Comanche tactics point out that speed of execution represented a central and deliberately cultivated element of these operations, with warring parties often completing an entire raid, from first contact to final withdrawal, in a period of time that could be measured in minutes rather than hours. This extraordinary speed, according to survivor accounts preserved through multiple independent sources, created a subjective experience that many later described as almost impossible to process adequately while it was genuinely happening, with several testimonies mentioning a sense of distorted time, where seconds seem to stretch in ways that trauma psychology researchers would recognize today as a documented neurological response to situations of extreme and sudden existential threat. Families living on isolated farms, often far from any nearby neighbors or any form of immediately available formal military protection, faced vulnerabilities that military researchers describe as structurally almost impossible to fully mitigate through any available individual preparedness, regardless of how much care and how much vigilance these particular families might exercise in their everyday lives. There are preserved accounts, examined by historians who study this specific dimension of the frontier experience, which describe how even families who maintained constant vigilance and who had defensive weaponry available still faced a fundamental disadvantage, represented by the simple physical impossibility of anticipating exactly when and from which specific direction a threat might materialize, considering the territorial vastness of the Texan plains and the Comanche's ability to approach through routes and through moments that extraordinary territorial knowledge, already examined in previous investigations in this series, made it genuinely difficult to predict through any conventional surveillance system available to isolated individual families. There is one specific account, preserved through later testimony collected decades after the events described, that illustrates in particularly vivid detail what it meant to experience the initial moments of an attack of this specific type. According to this testimony, preserved in regional historical collections in Texas and examined by historians who study this period, a woman who survived the raid on her family property described her first warning sign as a subtle change in the behavior of her own domestic animals, chickens that suddenly stopped making loud noises, characteristic, and a family dog that began to show unusual agitation without barking, as if it also felt an instinctive need to remain silent in the face of a threat that had not yet become visible. This specific pattern, where domestic animals seem to react to the presence of threat before humans could detect it through their own senses, appears, according to researchers who compile multiple similar testimonies, preserved through different decades, with enough frequency to suggest a genuine phenomenon and not merely isolated coincidence or retrospective elaboration of memory. Some researchers of animal behavior applied to historical contexts suggest an explanation that combines the superior sensory capacity that certain domestic animals genuinely possess to detect movement and vibration at greater distances than conventional human perception allows, with the additional possibility that Comanche horsemen, through training and through techniques already examined in previous investigations in this series on Comanche tactical sophistication, could genuinely approach with a level of stealth that made direct human detection genuinely more difficult than indirect detection through preceding animal reaction. What happened in the next few minutes, according to the same specific testimony, involved an extraordinarily quick decision about whether to reach for a weapon available within the family residence versus immediately trying to gather and protect children present, with the survivor describing, decades later, still carrying personal uncertainty about whether the specific decision she made at that moment represented a genuinely correct choice, or whether it had instead simply been the result of panic and instinct that did not allow, in practice, any truly rational deliberation within the extraordinarily limited time available. The question of how different specific families, facing the same general category of sudden threat, made dramatically different decisions about how to respond deserves further exploration, as it reveals significant variation that researchers consider revealing about multiple factors that influence these decisions made under extreme pressure. Researchers compiling and comparing multiple accounts from different survivors identify a pattern where the decision between attempting direct defensive resistance, attempting immediate escape, or attempting to hide within one's property often depended on specific factors, including geographic proximity to available weaponry at the exact time of detection of the threat, number and age of children present that needed to be simultaneously considered, and specific prior knowledge about immediate surrounding terrain that could offer genuinely viable hiding options versus more open terrain that would offer minimal or no protection. There are preserved accounts of families who chose to seek refuge in specific structures within their own properties, including in some documented cases, wells or other underground structures that offered, at least theoretically, the possibility of more complete physical concealment than any conventional housing structure could provide. Other accounts describe families who opted instead for an immediate attempt to escape through direct movement to terrain that offered natural cover, including dense vegetation or specific rock formations, a choice that, according to historical analyses that examine comparative results between different documented strategies, seem to offer, in certain specific geographic circumstances, a relatively higher success rate than attempts to remain and defend a fixed position against the threat that it possessed, according to previous investigations in this series on Comanche tactical capacity, numerical advantage and mobility advantage that made static defense genuinely challenging to sustain successfully for a significant period of time. The true meaning behind this documented variation between different strategies and between different specific outcomes is that there was, according to researchers, examining the broader pattern revealed through multiple comparative cases, a single, universally applicable formula that guaranteed survival, with each specific situation presenting a unique combination of geographic, familial, and circumstantial factors that made any decision made, even retrospectively examined through careful historical analysis, genuinely difficult to categorize simply as objectively correct or objectively incorrect within the specific and genuinely impossible context in which it was originally made. There is also a specific dimension related to how adults responsible for children, those involved during these particular attacks, faced the additional and genuinely devastating challenge of trying to protect multiple dependents simultaneously, often with physical resources and time on their hands that made complete and simultaneous protection of all family members genuinely impossible. Researchers examining this specific aspect through preserved testimonies document multiple accounts where mothers and fathers had to, in a matter of seconds, make decisions about which specific child to try to reach and protect first, considering factors such as age, the specific child's physical ability to move quickly, and each child's immediate geographic proximity to the responsible adult at the exact moment the threat became evident. These accounts, preserved through testimony that specific survivors would provide decades later, often reveal, according to historians who examine them with sensitivity appropriate to the extraordinarily painful nature of these memories, lasting psychological weight that these moments of impossible decision posed, with multiple survivors describing, even decades after the original events, ongoing and genuinely persistent difficulty in fully processing decisions they had been forced to make under extreme pressure, regardless of the specific end result that those particular decisions had produced. Some historical trauma psychology researchers point out that this specific type of experience, where personal survival, or the survival of some specific family members, coexisted with simultaneous loss of other equally loved family members, represents a particular category of trauma that contemporary psychologists would recognize as genuinely distinct and, in some respects, even more complex than simple exposure to direct physical threat taken alone, involving the additional dimension of survivor guilt and retrospective questioning about impossible decisions that no conventional psychological preparation could have adequately prepared these specific people to face. This specific dimension of suffering documented among survivors of Comanche attacks directly connects, according to researchers who compared different similar historical contexts, already examined in previous investigations in the series, with comparable psychological patterns documented among survivors of other traumatic historical events, suggesting that the fundamental nature of this specific type of human suffering transcends specific historical or geographic context considered in isolation, reflecting instead a more universal and more genuinely tragic dimension about how human beings process impossible decisions made under circumstances of extreme and genuinely sudden existential threat. There is also a specific set of reports related to strategies that some families developed through accumulated experience or through knowledge shared with neighbors about previous incidents, specifically aimed at maximizing the chance of survival if they faced a similar attack in the future. Researchers examining these preventative strategies document specific practices that some border families developed, including deliberate maintenance of pre-identified and mentally rehearsed escape routes, strategic placement of weaponry in multiple locations within the primary residence to ensure quick access regardless of each family member's exact location at the time of any future attack, and in some documented cases, development of specific silent signals that family members used among themselves to communicate warning without the need for verbalization that could itself alert attackers to their presence, of potential victims not yet detected. Some historians who study these specific adaptive practices point out that they represent similar to patterns already examined in previous investigations in the series about entire communities developing mutual warning systems related specifically to the Comanche Moon, a further example of remarkable human capacity for developing sophisticated adaptive strategies, even in the face of a threat that remained. In terms of fundamental unpredictability about the exact timing of any specific future incident, genuinely impossible to completely eliminate through any available preparation. There is also specific documentation on how this type of preparation, although genuinely useful in certain documented circumstances, where it appears to have directly contributed to the successful survival of specific families, also created, according to historical psychological analyses applied to this context, an additional form of chronic anxiety and co-vigilance. The situation itself became a significant psychological burden on the daily lives of these families, even during long periods where no real and immediate threat genuinely materialized, creating permanent tension between the practical need for continuous preparation and the natural human desire for some degree of psychological normality and everyday tranquility that chronic and unpredictable threat made genuinely difficult to fully achieve. The question of how neighbors and broader communities responded when they received, through whatever means available, a signal about an attack occurring or having recently occurred on a nearby property also deserves specific consideration within this investigation, revealing an additional dimension to how informal social networks functioned, or in some documented cases, failed to function properly, during times of extreme crisis. Researchers examining patterns of community response document cases, where neighbors, upon noticing specific signs of an attack taking place on nearby property, whether through the sound of gunfire, through visible smoke, or through other direct indicators, faced a genuinely difficult decision about whether to attempt immediate intervention that could potentially save lives, but which also carried a substantial and historically documented risk of exposing the intervening family itself to additional and comparable danger, versus prioritizing the immediate and exclusive protection of their own nuclear family, even though they were aware of the possibility that this specific choice could mean the avoidable loss of lives of neighbors, which could, theoretically, have been saved through faster and more direct intervention. This specific dilemma, documented through multiple accounts where both choices, risky intervention versus priority family protection, appear represented among different individuals facing comparable circumstances, illustrates, according to researchers of historical ethics applied to contexts of extreme crisis, genuine moral complexity that this specific type of chronic and recurrent threat imposed on the broader social structure of border communities, requiring ordinary individuals to face, repeatedly throughout their own lives, extraordinarily difficult ethical decisions that no conventional social or institutional structure could adequately prepare anyone to face with complete and genuinely moral clarity. Reassuring. From this point on, reports of survival experience become even more disturbing, particularly when we examine specific cases where attacks resulted not in immediate death, but in capture, creating a distinct and genuinely complex category of survival experience that deserves its own carefully developed exploration within this investigation. Researchers who study the specific experience of people captured during Comanche raids, a dimension already examined in considerable depth in a previous investigation in this series dedicated specifically to this topic, point out that the initial moment of capture represented, according to multiple preserved testimonies, a psychological experience genuinely different from the experience of witnessing or directly escaping lethal violence, involving immediate confrontation with extreme and prolonged uncertainty about one's own future destiny that differed significantly from the more acute but also more quickly resolved terror associated with the threat of direct and immediate death. Preserved accounts of people who survived the experience of capture, even when temporary and even when eventually resulting in successful return to communities of origin, often describe, according to analyses of these testimonies, initial moments of forced transport through unknown territory as a period of extreme physical and psychological disorientation, where the simple task of maintaining awareness of geographic direction and distance traveled became genuinely challenging, given the speed of movement and given the understandably compromised emotional state of any person recently captured in these circumstances. Some of these specific accounts mention initial attempts to memorize specific geographic landmarks, motivated by hope of eventual escape or the eventual ability to guide future rescue to the exact location where they were being held, although researchers who examine these accounts with attention to practical details point out that the actual ability of any captured person to genuinely maintain accurate geographic tracking, considering both extreme emotional state and speed and complexity of routes that experienced Comanche groups typically used, was probably significantly more limited than the initial hope of these captured people would have suggested. During the initial moments of this traumatic experience, there is also a specific dimension relating to how people who managed, through different documented circumstances, to evade capture after an initial period often faced the additional and genuinely dangerous challenge posed by the return journey itself through unknown and potentially hostile territory, without any guarantee that that initial escape represented final and genuinely safe resolution of their wider situation. Researchers, examining specific accounts of successful escape after capture document journeys that could extend for days, often conducted through nocturnal movement, specifically to minimize risk of detection, with individuals navigating limited and often imprecise knowledge of correct geographic direction to reach any known settlement that could offer genuine safety. These reports, according to historians who examine them with specific attention to practical details of the survival experience during these journeys, often mention additional challenges related to obtaining water and food during the period of flight, with several individuals describing the need to consume wild plants of uncertain identification or to drink water from sources of dubious quality, creating an additional risk of disease that directly overlapped the already significant risk represented by the very possibility of discovery and recapture during this vulnerable period of solitary journey through unknown territory. Some historians who compile multiple accounts of this specific type of experience point out that the actual success rate of these escape attempts after capture remains genuinely difficult to determine with complete statistical accuracy, as available records inevitably capture predominantly cases of eventual success, with any attempt that had resulted in death during the escape journey itself remaining, in most cases, without corresponding documentation that could definitively confirm what had genuinely happened to specific individuals who were simply never again located or identified through any available historical source. There is also a specific question related to how source communities processed and responded when they received news about a specific family member having been captured but not yet returned or definitively located, creating a period of prolonged uncertainty that historical psychology researchers consider a particular and genuinely devastating category of family distress. Researchers examining preserved correspondence from families facing this specific situation document a pattern where continued hope about possible survival and eventual return coexisted, through a period that could extend for years in some documented cases, with a gradual and genuinely distressing recognition of the increasing statistical improbability of successful return as additional time passed without any confirmed news of the captured person's specific fate. Some historians who study this particular aspect of the border experience point out that specific prolonged uncertainty, without clear resolution through definitive confirmation about death or about continued survival, represents, according to researchers of grief psychology applied to historical contexts, a particular form of suffering that contemporary psychologists would recognize as genuinely distinct, and in some respects even more psychologically challenging than more conventional grief related to loss, confirmed and definitively established through any concrete evidence available. There are preserved accounts of families who maintained, over subsequent decades and even after any reasonable expectation of return had become statistically extremely unlikely, a continued practice of keeping a specific room prepared or of continuing to include a captured person in regular family and religious practices as if survival and eventual return remained genuinely possible, a psychological pattern that contemporary researchers would recognize as a coping mechanism that allowed the preservation of functional hope, even in the face of increasingly unfavorable statistical probability, without the need to directly confront the more likely but also more devastating possibility of permanent and irreversible loss. This first part of this investigation examined multiple specific dimensions related to the immediate experience of surviving a Comanche attack, from the first warning signs to impossible decisions about family protection, and even the distinct experience represented by capture and the eventual attempt to escape and return. Before moving forward, it is worth examining in more detail a specific aspect related to how different types of property and physical structure directly affected survival capacity during these attacks, revealing a practical and genuinely concrete dimension that complements more psychological analyses already developed previously in this investigation. Researchers studying border defensive architecture point out that the specific type of housing construction available to different families, often determined by economic factors and time available since initial property establishment, created significant differences in actual defensive capacity that could, in certain documented circumstances, make a genuine difference between survival and tragedy. More robust log structures, with thicker walls and strategically positioned limited openings, offered, according to historical military analyses applied to this specific context, significantly superior defensive capacity compared to simpler and more quickly constructed structures that many families newly arrived on the frontier initially possessed, before having the time and resources available to develop more elaborate and more genuinely defensible constructions. Some specific preserved accounts mention how certain families, recognizing this initial architectural vulnerability, developed compensatory strategies, including prior identification of specific location within neighboring properties that had more robust construction, with an informal agreement established between nearby families about seeking mutual refuge in a more defensible structure available if either family faced a specific threat, creating an informal network of defensive cooperation that complemented, in some successfully documented cases, individual limitations that any isolated and individually considered property could present. This specific architectural dimension, according to historians who examine it in conjunction with psychological and behavioral factors already discussed previously, illustrates how survival during these attacks depended on a complex combination of concrete physical factors and behavioral and psychological factors, without any isolated category being able by itself to guarantee a specific result independently of other factors simultaneously relevant to any particular situation faced. There is also a specific dimension related to how certain families developed, through experience or through shared knowledge, a capacity for direct negotiation during moments of confrontation that, although it certainly did not guarantee a favorable outcome, seemed, according to some preserved accounts, to at least offer an additional possibility of non-lethal resolution that researchers consider historically significant to examine with appropriate care. Researchers examining these specific accounts of attempted direct negotiation document cases where individuals, recognizing the impossibility of effective physical resistance or successful escape, chose to attempt direct communication with attackers. In some cases, using limited knowledge of words or gestures they had learned through previous, more peaceful contact with indigenous groups in the region, offering specific material goods or other forms of concession in exchange for saving family lives. These accounts, when preserved, suggest that the outcome of such attempts varied significantly, with some documented cases of apparent success where specific families reported surviving through what they interpreted as successful negotiation, while other accounts suggest that similar attempts did not produce a result distinct from that which would have occurred without any attempt at direct communication. Some historians who study this particular pattern point out necessary caution about interpreting these accounts, suggesting that additional factors not directly related to the negotiation attempt itself, including the specific composition and tactical objectives of the particular attacking group, or specific circumstances not adequately captured through necessarily simplified later reporting, probably influenced the final outcome as much as, or possibly more than, any specific attempt at communication or direct negotiation that the survivor would later attribute as the primary causal factor for their own specific survival. There is also an additional question related to how religion and personal faith, a dimension already examined in considerable depth in a previous investigation in this series specifically dedicated to religious practices related to the Comanche moon, manifested itself specifically during moments of active attack, rather than just during the previously discussed period of preparation and anticipation. Researchers examining survivor testimonies with specific attention to this dimension document multiple references to spontaneous and immediate prayer during moments of active attack, with several accounts describing verbal or mental invocation of divine protection precisely during the most critical and most terrifying seconds of direct confrontation with immediate threat. Some of these specific accounts explicitly attribute personal or family survival to perceived divine intervention. describing specific moments where a seemingly arbitrary decision or seemingly improbable coincidence, a specific attacker who appeared unaware of a hidden person, or a gun that failed to fire at the critical moment at the attacker, or any other element of pure contingency that could have resulted dramatically differently, was interpreted, retrospectively, as direct evidence of divine protection responding precisely to that desperate and immediate prayer offered during a moment of greatest danger. This specific religious interpretation of events during the moment of attack itself, complementing and expanding the broader analysis already developed in a previous investigation in this series on the religious dimension related to this broader historical conflict, illustrates, according to researchers in historical religious psychology, how personal faith functioned not only as a preventative and ritualized practice before any specific threat materialized, but also as an active and genuinely significant psychological resource during the moment of extreme crisis itself, offering both possible immediate spiritual comfort and a later interpretative framework that helped survivors process and make sense of experiences they might otherwise have had, remain genuinely incomprehensible or genuinely arbitrary in their fundamental nature. The second part of this investigation will continue to explore what happened in the hours and days immediately following a successful attack for the direct survivors, including the help-seeking process, initial processing of severe trauma, and eventual reconstruction of everyday life in the face of devastating loss that many of these specific survivors needed, in some genuinely extraordinary way, to find the capacity to perform. The hours immediately following a successful attack represented, according to researchers who reconstruct this specific phase through preserved testimonies, a genuinely challenging transition period between the acute terror of direct confrontation and the immediate practical need to seek help, to process losses, and to ensure continued security against the ever-present possibility of the return of the same attacking group or the arrival of an additional, unrelated group. Researchers examining these accounts document a consistent pattern where direct survivors, even those physically unharmed, often experienced what contemporary psychologists would recognize as a state of acute shock, with multiple testimonies describing initial difficulty in fully processing the scale of loss and destruction they had just witnessed, creating a period of near automatic functioning where necessary practical actions, checking for injuries, searching for scattered family members, assessing the immediate safety of the area, were conducted through what survivors would later describe as a kind of emotional autopilot that allowed basic practical functioning before more complete emotional processing become genuinely possible. There are specific accounts of how survivors needed, during this initial period of shock, to make additional decisions about immediate priorities, including the practical but genuinely distressing question of whether to seek outside help immediately, temporarily leaving the local situation without additional supervision, versus remaining on site to care for the injured or to confirm the fate of people not yet located, before undertaking any journey to seek wider assistance. The question of how exactly survivors determined the specific direction and destination to seek help, considering the geographic isolation characteristic of many border properties already examined in previous investigations in the series, represented an additional practical challenge that directly overlapped with the already significant emotional trauma that these individuals were simultaneously processing. There's a specific account, preserved through family correspondence, examined by historians who study this period, which illustrates in particular detail this phase immediately following a devastating attack. According to this account, one specific survivor, after confirming that there was no longer an immediate threat present at the P property, had to make a decision about undertaking a journey lasting several hours to the nearest neighboring property, temporarily leaving other family members injured but stable, a decision that the survivor himself would describe decades later as one of the most difficult of his entire life. Knowing that each minute of absence represented both the practical need to seek more specialized medical help and additional risk if the situation on the property deteriorated during his specific absence. This specific account, according to detailed historical analysis, describes a journey conducted in a state that the survivor himself would characterize as a mixture of practical determination and delayed emotional processing, with specific sensory details of the landscape traversed remaining, in his own preserved words, vividly etched in memory in a way that directly contrasted with more significant gaps in his memory about immediately preceding events during the attack itself. A pattern that trauma neuroscience researchers would recognize today as a documented manifestation of how the human brain processes and stores memory differently during different phases of extreme traumatic experience. The eventual arrival of available assistance, according to the same account, brought both immediate practical relief and, paradoxically, an additional moment of more intense emotional processing, with the survivor describing how the need to verbally articulate, for the first time, what had happened represented a moment where the full reality of the situation seemed, in his own words, to finally become real in a way that immediately preceding direct experience however paradoxical it may seem, had not genuinely managed to produce. There's also a specific dimension related to how broader communities, once receiving news of a specific attack, organized a collective response that included both immediate medical assistance and, in cases where applicable, attempts to pursue or further rescue related family members who remained captured or missing. Researchers examining patterns of community response document that, although available, formal military capacity was often limited, as discussed in previous investigations in this series, on broader structural limitations of the border protection system. Civilian communities often organized through their own initiative and through voluntary cooperation between neighbors. Search and assistance groups that operated relatively quickly and relatively effectively within the practical limitations that genuinely challenging circumstances imposed. These community groups, according to preserved accounts, often included not only basic medical assistance available through shared practical knowledge, but also coordinated efforts to locate and recover bodies of fatal victims, a process that researchers of historical burial practices point to as carrying genuinely important emotional and cultural significance for border communities, which deeply valued the ability to provide adequate and ceremonially appropriate burial for deceased members, even in the face of the extraordinarily challenging logistical and emotional circumstances that this particular task represented. Some preserved accounts also document more ambitious community attempts at direct pursuit against specific raiding groups, although military researchers examining these efforts point out that the actual success rate of these civilian pursuits, considering limitations already examined in previous investigations of tactical advantage and Comanche mobility, was genuinely limited, with many of these efforts resulting in failure to reach a specific raiding group before that group was able, through already extensively documented superior movement capabilities, to reach distance and safety considered sufficient within its own planned withdrawal strategy. There is also a specific question related to how the process of mourning and emotional reconstruction developed over subsequent weeks and months for families who had lost specific members during these attacks, revealing a broader temporal dimension that complements the more immediate analysis already developed in the first part of this investigation. Researchers examining preserved correspondence and diaries of survivors through this extended period document a pattern where grief processing often coexisted with the immediate and inescapable practical need to continue maintaining the basic functioning of the family farm, creating genuine tension between the emotional need to process devastating loss and the material need equally. There is an urgent need to continue producing food and maintaining the family economic structure that the continued survival of remaining family members genuinely requires. This forced coexistence between deep mourning and ongoing practical responsibility, according to analyses of historical psychology applied to this specific context, represents a pattern that contemporary researchers would recognize as genuinely challenging even by current standards of understanding about healthy grief processing, suggesting that many of these specific families faced circumstances that made any more gradual and more carefully conducted grieving process genuinely impractical within the material and economic reality that their specific situation imposed. Some historians who study this particular aspect of the frontier experience point out that this need for continued practical functioning, despite genuinely devastating trauma and grief, may have contributed, paradoxically, both to the apparent resilience that many of these particular families would demonstrate through subsequent decades, and to patterns of inadequately processed psychological distress that, similar to patterns already examined in this series' previous investigation into soldiers' experiences in prolonged sieges, likely persisted, in ways that available historical records capture only partially and fragmentarily, long afterward. Any immediate practical resolution of the original crisis situation itself. The question of how children who survived these attacks, especially those young enough to have limited or genuinely fragmentary memory about specific events, processed and eventually incorporated these experiences into their own identity and subsequent psychological development, also deserves specific consideration within this comprehensive investigation. Researchers examining preserved memories of people who, decades later as adults, reflected on childhood experiences related to these specific attacks, document significant variation in how different individuals process these memories throughout their own subsequent lives, with some describing a relatively successful integration capacity that allowed for healthy psychological functioning in adulthood, while other reports suggest more persistent patterns of anxiety or emotional difficulty that seem to connect directly, according to retrospective analysis by these individuals themselves, to specific traumatic experiences lived during formative childhood years. Some historical developmental psychology researchers point out that documented variation in these long-term psychological outcomes likely reflected multiple factors, including specific age at the time of the original trauma, quality and quantity of emotional support available through remaining family and through the broader community during the subsequent recovery period, and individual factors of psychological resilience that, even across comparable historical circumstances, produced genuinely distinct outcomes among different specific individuals facing traumatic experiences similar in their fundamental nature. This documented variation, according to contemporary researchers who study historical childhood trauma, offers an important and genuinely relevant lesson for broader understanding of how specific trauma affects individual psychological development. That there is no single, universally predictable outcome, but rather a spectrum of possible trajectories that depend on the complex interplay between specific traumatic experience and multiple additional factors that vary significantly among different individuals, even when those specific individuals have faced, in objective terms, a genuinely comparable and historically similar category of experience. There is an additional dimension related to how these specific survival experiences eventually became part of a larger narrative tradition passed down through subsequent family generations, revealing how the original traumatic memory gradually transformed through a process of repeated oral transmission into a more established element of identity and broader family history. Researchers who study intergenerational transmission of family historical narratives document that descendants of survivors often preserved, through successive generations, specific versions of these survival stories, with details and with emphases that, according to comparative analysis between different preserved versions of the same family history through different generations, gradually evolved in ways that reflected both genuine fidelity to central elements of the original experience, eigenal, as well as inevitable narrative reformulation that the process of repeated oral transmission through multiple generations typically produces. Some historians who compare different preserved versions of these family narratives point out that specific elements relating to moments of greatest dramatic tension or particularly significant decisions tended to be preserved with greater consistency through successive generations, while more factual or more practical details, such as exact temporal sequence or precise geographic identification, often demonstrated greater variation and increasing in accuracy as the number of generations of oral transmission progressively increased. This pattern of narrative transmission, according to family historical memory researchers, illustrates how specific traumatic events, originally experienced by specific individuals in particular historical circumstances, gradually transform into a broader part of collective family identity that transcends original individual experience, serving the important social and psychological function of preserving connection with specific family past, even when complete factual accuracy about specific details inevitably becomes, through multiple generations of oral transmission, progressively more difficult to verify and confirm through any additional and independently available historical documentation. As we conclude this comprehensive investigation into the experience of surviving Comanche raids on the Texas frontier, it is important to reflect on what this detailed exploration, conducted through multiple layers of historical and psychological analysis throughout both parts of this investigation, reveals about the broader and more universal human dimension of survival in the face of sudden and genuinely terrifying existential threat. The stories examined throughout this investigation, from subtle early warning signs through animal behavior, to impossible decisions about simultaneous family protection, to the distinct experience of capture and eventual escape, to the prolonged process of seeking help and subsequent emotional reconstruction, collectively reveal a genuinely human and genuinely complex portrait of what it meant, concretely, to survive one of the most terrifying types of attacks documented in the history of the American frontier. These stories, important to recognize again as already established through previous investigations in this series that have examined Comanche perspectives with comparable depth, represent only one side of a genuinely more complex and more multifaceted historical conflict, where genuine and historically documented human suffering existed and continues to be recognized by contemporary historians on both sides of this protracted confrontation between American colonial expansion and Comanche territorial and cultural resistance. The final question that this thorough investigation leaves for broader reflection is how contemporary societies can adequately honor the genuine emotional and historical complexity of these specific survival experiences, recognizing both the genuine, historically documented terror that these frontier families faced and the broader historical context of territorial conflict and indigenous resistance that this comprehensive series of investigations has examined through multiple complementary perspectives, thereby simultaneously honoring the shared and historically proven humanity of all those directly affected by this specific but genuinely revealing chapter in the broader American story. Sources and reference works for further exploration. Historical records from the Texas State Library and Archives Commission relating to testimonies from survivors of Comanche incursions. The Comanche Empire by Pekka Hämäläinen, Empire of the Summer Moon by S.C. Gwynn, historical psychology research on trauma processing in 19th century contexts of frontier violence, documentation preserved in regional Texas museums relating to personal accounts and family correspondence of survivors, analyses of border defensive architecture, preserved in regional historical collections, comparative studies of developmental psychology applied to historical childhood trauma, documented through preserved memories of adult survivors reflecting on childhood experiences.